Hello and welcome to the Holistic Psychiatrist Podcast, where we're building well-being from the thought up. I'm your host, Dr. Alice Lee. I'm a holistic psychiatrist practicing in Lehi, Utah. And today we're going to talk about a topic that is very relevant to a lot of people, which is the most practical approach and treatment for ADD and ADHD. And why is this important? It's because currently psychiatrists will listen to the psychiatric history for children, come up with a list of symptoms, and usually they go right to prescribing a stimulant for that child, and basically think that that's the entirety of the treatment for ADD. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to think about ADD differently, ADHD, and what other holistic options there are for children and adults diagnosed with this particular diagnosis. And we're going to share some important insights on this topic and some effective strategies for mitigating and the debilitating symptoms associated with ADD and ADHD. So to help me with our discussion is Jack Rome, and it's really great to have him here because he always gets all that information out of me just very easily, and just want to welcome him. So Jack is a digital media artist. He's a music producer. He's a writer and editor. His website is jackintheway.net. My website is holisticpsychiatrist.com. When you go there, you'll find all my podcasts as well and my holistic updates, all my written articles, which I hope would be helpful for you. So let's go ahead and begin. Welcome, Jack, to the podcast. I'm really grateful for you to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is definitely going to be a really interesting topic. We've had a few conversations offline a little bit about this, but I'm glad to be able to dive in with a whole podcast episode about this. And I'm sure others listening will appreciate it as well. And with all that said, I think let's just start at the beginning with the simplest, most obvious question, which is, what is ADD or ADHD from your perspective?
So with ADD and ADHD, of course, we have the symptoms of inattention, distractibility, perhaps hyperactivity, and that's where the H is in ADHD, versus someone who is not hyperactive. Mm-hmm. So children tend to be struggling with organization, planning. They can be forgetful because they're not paying attention. And certainly it has nothing to do with their intelligence. You can be extremely creative and intelligent, but still have problems with distractibility and focus. So that's a basic understanding in terms of symptoms, which is what most psychiatrists go off of. But from a holistic psychiatrist perspective, the understanding that I have about ADD and ADHD has more to do with different types of attention. So what I mean by that is that I kind of consider that the school system and maybe inside the library, the kind of attention that is desirable and wanted is the kind of attention that you would typically call a scholar's attention. Someone whose attention is kind of narrow and deep. They're calm. They're not distracted easily by external stimuli, and they can sit at the desk for a long period of time without feeling antsy. But the kind of attention that I see in ADD or ADHD is that of a warrior like a fighter, a soldier. An attention span of a warrior, what's appropriate for that individual would be much more 360 degrees. They're always paying attention to everything around them. And the blood flow isn't, diverted to the GI system. It's actually diverted to the muscles so that it's more of a fight or flight response. And in that way, someone in that kind of type of attention span, they're perfect for a situation where they have to react quickly. They have to be open to all sorts of small sounds. that might require attention. And in that setting, there's also what we would consider the hyper-focused type of attention. When
Mm.
you're in a exciting video game, or when you're, like in a stressed situation, like when you're procrastinating during your end of semester report or
Mhm.
paper, and you're like hyper focused on it, trying to finish in the middle of the night. That's kind of also part of the warrior's attention span, the hyper focus state.
Mm.
So, um, so from my perspective, it's not about a deficit of attention. It's more about a different kind of attention. And if
Mm.
you were to put someone like a scholar's attention span in a warlike setting, they just wouldn't survive. But if you put
Mhm.
a warrior's attention span in a classroom setting, it's really hard to contain that, because the person is
Mhm.
not in the same mindset to just narrowly focus on one little piece of data. So from that perspective, the question is, what causes these two types of attention span? And the scholar's attention
Mm.
span is more like that of a parasympathetic nervous system driven attention span. A warrior or a soldier's attention span is driven by the sympathetic nervous system, which is more of the
Mm.
fight or flight reaction. So, what about the kind of attention where a person is distractible, but they're not hyperactive? And I would say that a lot of times the distractible ADD is often found in, you can explain some part of it by thinking about the hormones, because I
Mm.
think with testosterone, you tend to kind of have that fight or flight response where the fight and the flight is a little bit more aggressive, as it's kind of mediated through the hormones of a boy. Whereas maybe for girls, they tend to be a little bit more distractible, because their fight or flight response, when they are trying to avoid stress, they're daydreaming. They're kind of going
Mm.
into their mind, and they're escaping in another way. So I
Mm.
think there's different approaches to how the fight or flight might show up in kids, but that's at least my current hypothesis about why
Mm.
certain presentations might come up.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, wow, that's really interesting, and makes a lot of sense. And I feel like as a kid, even though I personally wasn't diagnosed with ADHD, I certainly had, siblings and friends and so many people. And to have had, if imagine kids having that insight would be so valuable. And I hope that there's a way to like really get that to like seep into the sort of the awareness and the consciousness of kids, which, I mean, you're
Yeah.
doing that work.
Well, I think that that's another important point, is that um, when you have a hypothesis that might try to explain the attention span of kids who have distractibility, it opens up a different way of looking at yourself rather than a deficit of attention. It's more about what are the stressors that cause a sympathetic nervous system to switch its need for
Mhm.
attention from a restful, peaceful state to a more stressed, um, coping state.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's very different than saying that you don't have attention span and therefore you immediately need to have a prescription for a stimulant.
So is what you were describing as the difference between sort of a more of a flight response versus more aggressive fight response, is that related to the difference between ADD and ADHD in the way that people have conventionally thought about it? What's the reason really for the H, the hyperactive part of that?
Well, the H is just basically, it stands for hyperactivity. So there's the
Right.
ADD, where the person just has problems with paying attention. And
Right.
then the H, ADHD, is someone who is very restless. I think from a functional perspective, it's really about how the stress response is manifesting in how the muscles want to run. The muscles
Mm.
get a lot of blood flow, and then they just want to run away from, this internal sense of threat or danger.
Mm-hmm.
Where that threat and danger is, of course, the child is not aware of it. It just feels like they need
Right.
to move away. They need to go run someplace else. They just don't feel comfortable just being still all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And what leads to that kind of disparity between how the muscles are reacting, I think, is highly dependent on the source of the stress, which could be a multitude of different kinds of things.
You teased a little bit early in the intro, sort of about, that there's clearly a difference between sort of the conventional approach to this. I mean, even using the term ADD or ADHD with the word deficit in it. And you talked about sort of a holistic approach to it. Could you speak in more detail about what the traditional and conventional approaches are and where they come from and what your opinion is
Mm-hmm.
about them, and maybe the harm that it does, or whatever other opinions and notes you have on it?
So, a traditional or conventional approach would usually get the list of symptoms. They might do some testing to corroborate for the symptoms, just to make sure that it's outside the normal range for attention and focus. Sometimes the testing will show someone who's extremely intelligent and they may be bored in class. And so they want to rule out those types of things. Sometimes it's due to learning disabilities, and they want to, address the learning disabilities rather than just thinking of the child as having attention deficit disorder. But usually, um, and in general, a psychiatrist would put these kids on a stimulant, which is basically something that heightens the ability to pay attention and focus by using a medication that is very, very similar to cocaine. So it activates the dopamine system, so that the dopamine system, which is all about attention and focus and reward, will be activated by the stimulant. But the problem with stimulants is that they can cause decrease in appetite. Um, they might work while they're, in your body, but then when it leaves your body, because a lot of these stimulants, they're not going to last, you know, in a regular way like our normal attention
Mm-hmm.
spans. But let's say if they start to come out of your body, the person experiences, number one, a huge increase in appetite, and number two, they'll feel really tired, and their attention and focus is even worse than,
Mm-hmm.
you know, before they even were put on the medication.
Mm-hmm.
So it just creates this cycle of dependency on the medication. Not only does it make the attention worse when the medication leaves the body, but they tend to have a really hard time in the morning waking up, because they're so exhausted from the withdrawals.
Mm-hmm.
So they're constantly going
Mm-hmm.
through, the stimulating effects and then the withdrawal effects of the medication. And they do have problems with eating while they're, on these medications. So they tend to be
Right.
nutritionally deprived after a while because they just don't want to eat. Um,
Right.
so that is how the conventional approach treats ADD. It does create this idea for the child from a very early time period of their lives on, that they can't really function without this medication. So it affects deeply their sense of identity and a sense of self-worth, and a sense of empowerment, because they feel like when they take the medication, all of a sudden they're doing much better in
Mm-hmm.
school, they're getting good grades.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't take that medication, they get in trouble with the teacher because they're, not able to focus and pay attention. Um, from a holistic psychiatrist perspective, I've always tried to understand why a stimulant might be helpful for someone who's already overactive, or, all over
Mm-hmm.
the place. Their mind is already hyperactive. They're paying attention to everything. And one of my hypotheses that I think makes a lot of sense is that the stimulant is recreating more of what we would consider the high alert form of the ADD. Meaning, like when you have a warrior who is on high alert, they will be super or hyper focused on something.
Um,
So when they are, so it's not like, someone with ADD can't focus. There are different kinds of focus under stressful situations. One is this super focused or hyper focused, narrow attention span, and one is where their attention span is 360 degrees. And I think the stimulants just increase the stress to a
mm,
place where they go into the hyper focus range. We
I see.
experience that oftentimes when we are procrastinating and we put
Right.
off our term paper until the very end, and we're like hyper focused because we're stressed and we're fearful that if we don't get that paper done by tonight, we're going to get an F
Mm-hmm.
in that class.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
that fear and the stress drives us into that hyper focused state. So I think that that's what stimulants do, because if it was creating more of a normal attention span, why wouldn't the appetite be the same? Why would the
Mm-hmm.
appetite all of a sudden be completely gone? I think
Yeah.
it's actually pushing the sympathetic nervous system even further into a higher stressed state. And that's why the
Mm,
appetite is even worse on the stimulants. Um,
mm-hmm.
and uh, and I think that, to me, when you put a kid on stimulants in an effort to kind of mitigate the problem with focus, it's a little bit like whipping a tired horse. Yes, the horse will run and it will
Mm,
go further, but it just, in the long run, the horse is going to be exhausted. It just can't
yeah.
handle any more work. I think that ADD and ADHD are some of the earlier symptoms of some kind of underlying stress. That's why it's oftentimes diagnosed during childhood. This is not because ADD and ADHD is a childhood disorder. I don't think of it
Mm-hmm.
at all like that. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a set of symptoms that happen at the early period of a
Mm,
stressor or multiple stressors. A real clear example would be if a individual becomes diagnosed with panic disorder or bipolar disorder or a
mm,
psychotic disorder. None of those disorders will often have good attention span. They're going to have their attention span
right.
affected, along with, mood problems, dysregulation. Um, which is not to say all of these diagnoses come with problems with attention and focus, because I think attention and focus problems arise due to the adrenals and the stress response from the adrenals. And maybe some of these other disorders are more with the GI system than it is with the adrenals.
Mm,
But the systems are so integrated and they work so closely together that if you have, let's say, a different disorder like depression or something, even though it may affect like, say, the liver or GI system more, I'm sure that the adrenals, which responds to stress, will also be affected. So when the
mm-hmm.
adrenals are exhausted, when they're overactive because of stressors, you're going to have a lot of problems with the sympathetic system being hyperactive, and then you're going to have problems with attention and
Mm.
focus.
I'm so grateful at my age to be able to receive this information so that one
Hmm.
day when I have children, I know not
Yeah.
to put them through that, and to be aware of what is really going on. And so I really appreciate you getting very specific. And again, I imagine I'm not the only one who appreciates this information. But but seriously, what are the alternatives in terms of like what would you say is the whole our holistic options
Hmm.
that can lessen symptoms, but at the same time be coming from a place where you recognize that there's not a deficit here. It's just
Hmm.
about maybe more alignment or harmony within their awareness.
Right. Well, ADHD and ADD, as I've just mentioned, is very early on onset of
Mm-hmm.
symptoms. So the
Mm-hmm.
stressors are just starting to show up in that child's body. So and I've mentioned the word stress. So stress can be from a lot of different factors. With children, it could be infections, toxins, and food sensitivities. It could also be hypersensitivities to food coloring and something similar like that. So
Mm.
if you can, or it could be nutritional deficiencies if they're not eating properly. So the underlying functional causes for ADD, I think, can be fairly easily mitigated, and um, it hasn't progressed quite as much, as maybe
Mm.
someone who has initially attention problems, but then evolved into a mood disorder or
I
bipolar
see.
disorder or psychotic disorder. So you have to kind of figure out, just like you would do with any other mental health problems, you have to figure out the underlying causes and then you treat
Mm.
them. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it could be something as simple as nutritional repletion, providing the nutritional supports, helping with the genetic underlying issues that may make detoxification difficult through the right supplements, and then making sure that that individual gets rid of certain foods that they are having a severe inflammatory reaction to. Because just like adults, when we're treating mental health problems, we're trying to heal underlying causes of inflammation and oxidative stress. Also, we can't forget traumas and a chaotic environment, whatever that might
Mm-hmm.
be.
Mm-hmm.
So there may be stress associated with the environment, whether it's family or school, or there could be bullying. That can really raise the sympathetic nervous system to the forefront rather than the parasympathetic. Again, you have that very
Mm-hmm.
highly defended um, person who's running on chronic stress, and their attention span is going to be that of a warrior and not a scholar, right?
Right. Right.
So the treatment would be, for example, you would do the diagnostic evaluation for underlying causes. Is it food sensitivity? Is there a genetic issue with detoxification? Is there
Right.
inflammation from infections? Um, are there toxins, exposure to lead or mercury? All of those different things. I
Mm-hmm.
typically do the testing pretty easily through energy testing techniques that can give me that data fairly quickly. But as a functional
Right. Mm-hmm.
doctor, you certainly can get some lab work and check for the underlying causes. Is the microbiome okay? That kind of stuff. You can
Mm-hmm.
mitigate, or you can help that individual sometimes with just cleaning up their diet, for example. So that can be very helpful. Another thing that you can use to really help would be anything that helps a child to calm down. So remember, it's this parasympathetic versus sympathetic. The sympathetic
Mm-hmm.
nervous system is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. And so anything that you
Mm-hmm.
can shift towards the rest and
Mm.
digest is going to be helpful. So there are
Yeah.
meditations for children. They can, do that to kind of help calm their nervous system down. And there's also different ways in which you can enhance what they call the heart coherence, the rhythm of the heart coherence. And you can find those different types of apparatuses
Mm-hmm.
through a place called Heart Math. So
Oh yeah.
that's more of a, learning process. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, just because a child has some actual functional and organic reasons why they may have problems with attention and focus, as they're getting better, we have to understand that the learned response needs to be remedied also, because they haven't really
Uh,
learned how to be organized. They haven't learned how to be,
uh,
methodical in their approach. So it's very helpful to coach them on how to do those things
mm,
properly, how to take notes during class, those kind of things.
mm-hmm.
Because by the time, they get better, maybe they haven't actually acquired certain skills. So they're a little bit behind some of the other kids because they haven't been able to acquire certain skills that kids have picked up much more easily
Mm-hmm.
because their attention span was a little bit longer.
Could you share some clinical stories of treatment success and sort of experiences that you've had that kind of inform the
Mm-hmm.
approach that you have now?
Yes. So I treated a young adult. He was in his 20s when he came to see me, and he had been on stimulants since he was about 7, and he wanted to be able to do well without stimulants. By the time he came to see me, he had already stopped taking the stimulants, but he just had the disorder. He had problems with attention and focus. And so we worked on providing both the functional and the energy medicine interventions to help him with his overall symptoms. It didn't take very long. I think
Mm.
we were working together for maybe 2 months at the most, and then
Oh.
he got better and moved on with his life. He was able to clean up his diet. He took some supplements. Eventually, he went on to find a vocation that he loved, working with wood, and he became a
Mm.
carpenter, got married, and had his own family, and was very successful and was able to do that without taking any stimulants. And
Mm.
then he surprised me by writing a book about his experiences. And one day I got an email from him saying, "Would you take a look at my book?" He had written over 52 chapters for his book, and he had shared his experience with having ADD um, and how it affected him. It was a really great book that he had written. It's still in the process of being worked on, and it needs to be edited and all that stuff. But he also asked me to write the foreword for his book,
Mm.
which was a really honor for me, but also challenging as I think about what I want to put in that foreword. But here's a young man who started taking stimulants because he would talk out loud in class, or speak up without raising his hand first. He was
Mm.
extremely curious and creative. With the stimulants, he became someone that fit in the classroom. Like, he would focus on his schoolwork rather than getting distracted by anything else. And um,
Mm.
the problem was that it affected his appetite, affected his self esteem. Of course, he wasn't eating very well, and so he became more nutritionally depleted. He was exhausted in the morning, couldn't get
Mm.
up for school, and really struggled with the withdrawal effects of the stimulants. And his journey, all his experiences, he wrote in his book to share with people what it felt like
Mm.
to be basically thinking that you have to take a medication for the rest of your life in order for you to function. And
Mm.
and the fact that he struggled so hard to find a way so that he wouldn't have to be on the medication, that he could restore his health, required a lot of will and determination and courage on his part. And so I really loved it when he sent me his book. His first name is Russell, and he sent me the book, and I read his entire book like in one day. So I just went through from beginning to end, and it was very gripping, like for me, because even as a psychiatrist who had worked with him, I was very much involved more in the objective clinical
Mm.
perspective of how to help him. But in his book, he really went deeper to share his heart about, um, what it felt like to be dependent on a medication and not wanting to take that medication, and how
Mm.
sad it was that his body really needed it to function, and some of the
Mm.
things that happened because of that.
Mm.
So that's one of my stories of one of my patients. People with ADD, as I said, if you can figure out what the underlying causes are, it's really not that hard to treat, because these are individuals who are in the early stages
Right.
of health problems. And
Right.
if you can catch it early on, you can really turn around that person's health, really treat the underlying causes, and allow them to be able to be well for the rest of their lives without having to be reliant on a medication that is high. It creates a lot of dependency. I mean, it's very
Yeah.
similar to cocaine. So putting kids on
Yeah.
those types of medications, we want to have alternatives and try those alternatives first before resorting to those kinds of
Wow.
medications.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm going to pass it back over to you to finish it up.
Thanks, Jack. I'm thankful that we had a chance to talk about this very important topic, and I hope that it's been helpful for everybody else who's been listening. And I hope you can share it with those who will benefit from this helpful perspective on ADD and ADHD. So I hope that you'll continue to come back and listen to our podcast, that you'll subscribe to it and give it a positive rating so other people will be able to enjoy it as well. Please subscribe to my website, holisticspsychiatrist.com, for wonderful stories and insights from my holistic practice. And of course, you can hear more about what Jack does with his music at jackintheway.net. I want to wish you all a great week and hope you'll come back for more stories and insights when we put out another podcast. Thanks and have a great week. Bye-bye.